This, a German pilot flying for 22 hours straight without sleep, his eyes wide open, pupils dilated, hands trembling as he grips the controls. A Japanese kamikaze pilot preparing for his final mission, not with prayers, but with a small white pill that transforms his fear into mechanical determination. An American bomber crew over the Pacific, their exhaustion vanishing as they swallow tablets that promise to keep them alert through another night of deadly missions. This isn't fiction. This is the hidden reality of World War II, a conflict where the line between soldier and addict became dangerously blurred. While history books focus on tanks and battlefields, they rarely mention the chemical warfare being waged inside the bodies of millions of combatants. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the war's most disturbing secrets: how methamphetamine, cocaine, morphine, and other powerful substances became essential weapons of war, transforming ordinary men into chemically enhanced killing machines. The year was 1938, and in the laboratories of Berlin, German scientists were perfecting something that would fundamentally alter warfare. They called it Pervitin, but the world would know it as methamphetamine. What began as a simple appetite suppressant was about to become the Third Reich's secret weapon against the human limitations of their own soldiers. Dr. Otto Ranke, the Wehrmacht's chief medical officer, had a problem. Modern warfare demanded soldiers who could fight for days without rest, march impossible distances, and maintain perfect alertness during extended operations. The human body was the weak link in Germany's military machine. Ranke's solution was as brilliant as it was terrifying. If soldiers couldn't naturally maintain peak performance, then chemistry would force them to do so. The first large-scale test came during the 1939 invasion of Poland. Wehrmacht units were issued small white tablets with simple instructions. Take one every few hours to maintain alertness. The soldiers had no idea they were consuming one of the most addictive substances known to man. The results were immediate and dramatic. German forces advanced with unprecedented speed. Soldiers who should have been collapsing from exhaustion instead fought with machine-like precision. Tank crews operated for days without break. Infantry units marched through the night and fought through the day without showing fatigue. But this enhancement came with a hidden price. The drug didn't eliminate the body's need for rest. It simply masked exhaustion. Soldiers were running their bodies into the ground without realizing it. Their hearts raced constantly, hands shook uncontrollably, and many began experiencing what officers called nervous conditions. The success in Poland convinced German leadership they had discovered the key to military supremacy. By 1940, German factories were producing over 35 million tablets per month. The Wehrmacht had become history's first methamphetamine-fueled army. The drug's effectiveness was most dramatically demonstrated during the Battle of France. German forces moved so quickly that even their own command struggled to keep up. French and British forces couldn't match the pace of an enemy that literally never slept. Panzer divisions pushed through the Ardennes in a continuous 72-hour advance, their crews sustained entirely by chemical stimulants. Individual stories paint a disturbing picture. Wehrmacht soldiers wrote home describing their new alertness pills with enthusiasm, not realizing they were documenting their own chemical transformation. One described feeling like a machine that never needs to stop, while another wrote about his ability to march all day and fight all night without feeling tired. The psychological effects were equally significant. Methamphetamine didn't just eliminate physical fatigue, it created invincibility and reduced empathy. Soldiers became more aggressive, more willing to take risks, and less concerned about consequences. This chemical-induced aggression would have profound implications for the war's conduct. Medical officers documented strange phenomena. Soldiers continued fighting when severely wounded, seemingly immune to pain. Others displayed superhuman endurance, carrying wounded comrades for miles without rest. But these benefits masked a growing crisis of addiction and psychological breakdown that German authorities worked desperately to conceal. As German forces prepared for their next major offensive, military planners saw chemical enhancement not as experimental, but as essential. The stage was set for an even more dramatic demonstration of drug-fueled military operations, one that would bring the Wehrmacht to Moscow's gates and forever change combat's nature. But Germany wasn't alone in recognizing chemical enhancement's potential. Across the world, other nations were conducting their own experiments, each developing unique approaches to creating the perfect chemically enhanced soldier. While Germany mass-produced methamphetamine tablets, other nations quietly developed their own chemical warfare programs, not against enemies, but against their own forces' natural limitations. The race to create the perfect combat drug had become a hidden front in the global conflict. In Japan, military researchers discovered a different approach. Rather than German-style stimulants, Japanese scientists focused on substances that would eliminate fear and hesitation. The result was a classified program producing pills designed to transform ordinary men into fearless warriors willing to undertake impossible missions. The Japanese program centered on combinations of stimulants and psychoactive compounds that created what researchers called combat transcendence. Soldiers reported feeling disconnected from their physical bodies, as if observing their own actions from a distance. Pain became irrelevant, fear disappeared, and self-preservation was chemically suppressed. This pharmaceutical approach to creating fearless soldiers found its most disturbing application in the kamikaze program. Pilots preparing for final missions were given specialized drug cocktails that eliminated natural reluctance to die. The romantic image of spiritual warriors choosing death for honor obscured the chemical reality of young men whose survival instincts had been pharmaceutically disabled. One former Japanese officer described the transformation he witnessed in kamikaze pilots after they received their courage pills. Men who had been visibly terrified hours before became calm, even eager to carry out attacks. They moved with mechanical precision, showing no emotional turmoil that should have accompanied such decisions. Meanwhile, in the United States, military researchers took a more systematic approach. The American program focused on scientific precision rather than mass distribution, conducting careful studies on how different substances affected combat performance. American bomber crews flying long Pacific missions were among the first to receive official stimulant rations, distributed as alertness aids, designed to keep air crews functioning during missions lasting over 20 hours. The American approach differed significantly from German and Japanese methods. Instead of treating all soldiers as potential drug users, the U.S. military targeted specific high-stress roles where chemical enhancement provided maximum tactical advantage. Pilots, submarine crews, and special operations forces received priority access to combat stimulants. British forces developed their own unique approach, focusing on substances that could help soldiers cope with psychological trauma. The British program recognized that shell shock and combat fatigue were major factors in military effectiveness and sought chemical solutions. British medical officers experimented with mild sedatives and mood stabilizers that could keep soldiers functional despite intense combat stress. Soviet forces, fighting for national survival, developed perhaps the most pragmatic approach. Facing massive casualties in desperate situations, Soviet leaders approved any substance that could improve combat performance. This included stimulants, painkillers, and experimental compounds considered too dangerous by other armies. Soviet soldiers defending Stalingrad were given powerful stimulants, allowing them to fight continuously for days without rest. The brutal urban warfare required constant alertness and endurance, exceeding normal human capacity. Chemical enhancement became a survival tool rather than tactical advantage. Even smaller nations joined the chemical enhancement race. Finnish forces fighting the Soviet Union used stimulants to maintain alertness during long Arctic nights. Hungarian and Romanian units received access to German-produced combat drugs through alliance agreements. The global scope of military drug use represented a fundamental shift in how nations approached warfare. For the first time, chemical enhancement became standard military practice rather than experimental curiosity. The implications would become clear as the war progressed, and the true costs of mass chemical enhancement began emerging. But the most dramatic and disturbing applications were still to come. The invasion of the Soviet Union would push German soldiers to new extremes of chemical dependence, while Japanese forces would develop even more radical approaches to pharmaceutical warfare. June 22, 1941, marked the beginning of the largest military operation in human history. Operation Barbarossa involved over 3.8 million troops advancing across a front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. But this massive operation had a secret component rarely discussed. It was the first major military campaign conducted by an army running almost entirely on methamphetamine. The scale of drug distribution was unprecedented. German quartermasters loaded supply trains not just with ammunition and food, but with millions of Pervitin tablets. Each soldier received a standard ration of stimulant pills alongside regular equipment. The Wehrmacht had officially transformed from a traditional army into a chemically enhanced force designed to operate beyond normal human limitations. The initial advance demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of this approach. German forces moved with mechanical precision, advancing continuously for days without pause. Soviet defenders found themselves facing an enemy that seemed immune to exhaustion and capable of maintaining combat effectiveness around the clock. Tank crews, sustained by constant stimulant consumption, operated vehicles for periods that should have been impossible. One panzer commander described driving his tank for 72 consecutive hours, stopping only to refuel and rearm. His crew showed no signs of fatigue despite the incredible demands of armored warfare. Infantry units displayed equally superhuman endurance. Companies that should have been combat ineffective continued advancing through the night, covering distances military planners had considered impossible. Soviet forces preparing defensive positions often found German troops already in their midst, having marched through the night without rest. The psychological impact on Soviet forces was devastating. Facing an enemy that never tired, never paused, and maintained perfect alertness during extended operations, many Soviet units began viewing the German advance as unstoppable. Chemical enhancement had created both tactical advantage and a psychological weapon that undermined enemy morale. Individual German soldiers experienced the invasion as a surreal combination of heightened awareness and growing physical deterioration. Letters home describe an almost dreamlike state of continuous action, where soldiers felt simultaneously invincible and increasingly disconnected from their bodies. One Wehrmacht soldier wrote describing his experience as, like a machine that never needs maintenance, capable of marching all day and fighting all night without feeling tired. He mentioned constant hand tremors and that food had become tasteless, but dismissed these as minor inconveniences compared to his enhanced combat capability. The medical consequences began appearing within weeks. Field hospitals reported increasing numbers of soldiers suffering from nervous exhaustion, symptoms modern medicine would recognize as severe amphetamine psychosis, paranoia, hallucinations, and complete psychological breakdown. German military physicians found themselves dealing with an unprecedented crisis. Soldiers who had been chemically enhanced for weeks began experiencing complete physical collapse. Their hearts, stressed by constant stimulant use, began failing. Their digestive systems, damaged by appetite-suppressing effects, could no longer process food properly. Despite growing medical problems, the tactical effectiveness convinced German commanders that benefits outweighed costs. Orders went out to increase stimulant distribution rather than reduce it. The Wehrmacht had become addicted to the combat effectiveness drugs provided, even as individual soldiers paid an increasingly terrible price. The siege of Leningrad provided a stark example of how chemical enhancement affected operations. German forces, sustained by stimulants, maintained positions in brutal Russian winter, under conditions that should have been impossible. Soldiers remained alert and combat-ready, despite exposure to temperatures that would normally cause immediate incapacitation. The chemical enhancement also affected combat's nature. German soldiers under methamphetamine influence displayed increased aggression and reduced empathy, leading to more brutal treatment of prisoners and civilians. The drugs didn't just enhance physical performance, they altered warfare's fundamental psychology. As the invasion progressed deeper into Soviet territory, supply lines delivering stimulants became increasingly strained. Units dependent on chemical enhancement began experiencing severe withdrawal symptoms when drug supplies were interrupted. This created a new vulnerability: armies that could be defeated not by superior firepower, but by cutting off chemical supply lines. The approach of winter posed additional challenges. The stimulants that had provided such advantage during summer began causing severe problems in extreme cold. Soldiers whose blood vessels had been constricted by constant drug use became especially vulnerable to frostbite and hypothermia. The failure to capture Moscow before winter dealt a devastating blow to German confidence in chemical enhancement. Despite having the most advanced combat drugs in the world, the Wehrmacht had failed to achieve its primary objective. This failure would force German military leaders to reconsider their approach and seek even more radical solutions. The Pacific War presented unique challenges that drove both American and Japanese forces to new extremes of chemical enhancement. The vast distances, brutal climate, and psychological demands of island warfare created conditions where traditional approaches proved inadequate, resulting in a hidden pharmaceutical arms race that would produce some of the most disturbing applications of combat drugs in military history. Japanese forces, facing increasingly desperate situations as Americans advanced across the Pacific, began developing transcendence compounds, drugs designed to eliminate the survival instinct itself. These weren't simply stimulants, but substances that fundamentally altered human psychology to make death preferable to surrender. The development reflected Japanese military philosophy that chemical enhancement should serve spiritual rather than tactical goals. Unlike German stimulants that aimed to make soldiers more effective, Japanese drugs sought to make them more willing to die. This philosophical difference would produce the most extreme applications of military pharmacology in the entire war. Japanese soldiers defending Iwo Jima received these transcendence compounds before the American invasion. The drugs produced detached calm that allowed defenders to fight with mechanical precision even in hopeless situations. American forces landing on the island encountered Japanese soldiers who seemed completely indifferent to their own survival, fighting with inhuman persistence that defied conventional military logic. The psychological impact on American forces was profound. Marines who had fought across the Pacific described the Japanese defenders as different from any enemy previously encountered. These soldiers seemed immune to fear, pain, and natural self-preservation instincts that normally influenced battlefield behavior. American forces developed their own approaches to pharmaceutical warfare. Long-range bombing campaigns against Japan required crew members to maintain perfect alertness during missions lasting over 20 hours. The solution was a carefully designed stimulant program that kept air crews functioning at peak efficiency throughout extended operations. American bomber crews flying from bases in the Marianas received alertness tablets before each mission. These drugs, based on American pharmaceutical research, were designed to maintain cognitive function without the extreme psychological effects of German-style stimulants. The goal was enhanced performance without loss of judgment. The effects were more subtle than German counterparts, but equally significant. Crews reported feeling mechanically alert during long missions, able to maintain concentration on complex procedures without the fatigue that normally accumulated during extended flights. The drugs allowed precision bombing operations that would have been impossible with naturally exhausted crews. Naval operations drove pharmaceutical innovation. Submarine crews, operating in cramped conditions for months, received specialized drug combinations designed to maintain mental stability during extended underwater operations. These compounds helped manage claustrophobia and stress that normally affected submarine personnel during long patrols. The kamikaze program represented perhaps the most extreme application of military pharmacology. Japanese pilots preparing for final missions received drug combinations that eliminated natural reluctance to die while maintaining cognitive function necessary for accurate attacks. This created chemically enhanced warriors who approached their own deaths with mechanical precision. The preparation process involved careful drug administration designed to produce specific psychological states. Pilots received stimulants to enhance alertness, anxiolytics to reduce fear, and dissociative compounds that created emotional detachment from their impending deaths. The result was men who could execute complex attack procedures while approaching destruction with inhuman calm. American forces defending against kamikaze attacks observed that these pilots seemed completely indifferent to defensive fire that should have caused them to break off attacks. The drug-enhanced pilots maintained perfect course stability even when aircraft were severely damaged, showing no signs of self-preservation instincts that would normally cause evasion. The Pacific theater also saw development of new medical applications. The brutal conditions of jungle warfare created massive casualties from disease and infection, leading to experiments with compounds that could maintain soldier effectiveness even when suffering from malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases. American forces in the Philippines received drug combinations that mask symptoms of tropical diseases while maintaining combat effectiveness. These compounds didn't cure underlying illnesses, but allowed soldiers to continue fighting despite conditions that would normally require immediate medical evacuation. The psychological impact extended beyond individual soldiers to entire units. Both American and Japanese forces found that chemically enhanced troops could maintain combat effectiveness in situations that would have broken conventional units. This created pharmaceutical escalation, where both sides felt compelled to increase combat drug use to match enemy capabilities. As the Pacific War approached its climax, Both sides were pushing human enhancement to unprecedented extremes. The development of even more powerful combat drugs would play a crucial role in the conflict's final phases, as desperate military leaders sought any advantage that could influence the outcome. The concentration camps of Nazi Germany became laboratories for the most horrific applications of pharmaceutical research in human history. While the Wehrmacht consumed millions of stimulant tablets, SS doctors conducted experiments that pushed medical ethics beyond any recognizable limit. These experiments, conducted under the guise of military medical research, would produce some of the most disturbing chapters in combat drug history. Dr. Josef Mengele, the infamous angel of death at Auschwitz, was particularly interested in how chemical compounds affected human performance under extreme stress. His experiments involved administering massive doses of stimulants, hallucinogens, and experimental compounds to prisoners, then observing their reactions to physical and psychological torture. The stated purpose was to develop enhanced interrogation techniques and create drugs that could improve German soldier performance under extreme conditions. However, the true nature had little to do with legitimate medical research, and everything to do with satisfying sadistic curiosity of SS doctors who faced no ethical constraints. Prisoners at Auschwitz were subjected to forced administration of methamphetamine in doses far exceeding anything given to German soldiers. The purpose was observing how the human body reacted to extreme stimulant overdoses, with particular attention to psychological breakdown points. These experiments provided no useful medical information, but caused unimaginable suffering to thousands of victims. Other concentration camps became testing sites for experimental combat drugs considered too dangerous for German soldiers. Prisoners were given prototype compounds designed to eliminate pain, enhance physical strength, or alter psychological states. Results were carefully documented by SS medical staff, creating an archive of human suffering disguised as scientific research. The drug experiments at Dachau focused on developing compounds that could help German soldiers survive extreme environmental conditions. Prisoners were subjected to hypothermia while under various stimulant influences, with researchers documenting how different drugs affected the body's response to extreme cold. These experiments, conducted in the name of helping German pilots survive if shot down over the North Atlantic, resulted in hundreds of deaths. Dr. Sigmund Rascher, one of the lead researchers at Dachau, was particularly interested in how stimulants affected the human body's response to high altitude and extreme pressure changes. His experiments involved placing prisoners in pressure chambers while administering various combat drugs, then observing how compounds affected their ability to survive rapid decompression. The research at Ravensbrück focused on developing drugs that could enhance female performance in combat situations. As German military losses mounted, Nazi leaders began considering women in combat roles and wanted to understand how chemical enhancement might affect female soldiers. The experiments involved administering combat stimulants to female prisoners and observing reactions to simulated combat conditions. The medical experiments extended beyond stimulants to include research into chemical compounds that could break down resistance during interrogation. SS doctors tested various combinations designed to make prisoners more compliant and willing to reveal information. These experiments were conducted with the goal of developing enhanced interrogation techniques for captured enemy soldiers. The documentation provides a horrifying glimpse into the complete abandonment of medical ethics in service of military objectives. SS doctors maintained detailed records, treating human subjects as laboratory animals, and documenting their suffering with clinical detachment. These records would later become crucial evidence in war criminal prosecutions. The experiments also included research into drugs that could enhance German soldier effectiveness in specific combat situations. Prisoners were forced to perform physical tasks while under various stimulant influences, with researchers documenting how different compounds affected strength, endurance, and pain tolerance. The goal was developing specialized drug combinations for different military operations. The psychological effects of combat drugs were studied using concentration camp prisoners as test subjects. SS doctors administered various psychoactive compounds and observed how they affected behavior, aggression, and willingness to follow orders. These experiments were designed to determine whether chemical enhancement could create more obedient and effective soldiers. The most disturbing aspect was their complete lack of scientific validity. Rather than conducting controlled studies that might advance medical knowledge, SS doctors engaged in systematic torture disguised as research. The experiments were designed to satisfy sadistic curiosity rather than produce useful information about combat drugs. The legacy of these medical experiments extends far beyond World War II. The complete abandonment of medical ethics in service of military objectives created precedents that would influence post-war discussions about limits of military medical research. The Nuremberg trials would establish principles for human experimentation, directly influenced by the horrors documented in concentration camps. As the war continued and German fortunes declined, the pressure to develop more effective combat drugs would drive even more extreme experimentation. The research conducted in concentration camps would inform the development of increasingly dangerous compounds designed to give German forces any possible advantage in their desperate struggle for survival. By 1943, initial optimism about chemical enhancement had given way to growing desperation among German military leaders. The early successes of methamphetamine-fueled operations had been followed by increasingly obvious problems: widespread addiction, medical complications removing soldiers from combat, and growing realization that chemical enhancement had severe limitations. The German response wasn't to reduce drug use, but to develop even more powerful and dangerous compounds. Military researchers began experimenting with combinations of stimulants, painkillers, and experimental psychoactive substances that pushed human enhancement far beyond anything previously attempted. The goal was no longer just improving soldier performance, but creating chemically enhanced warriors who could continue fighting under impossible conditions. The development of these new compounds coincided with Germany's increasingly desperate military situation. As Allied forces gained the upper hand on multiple fronts, German commanders became willing to accept almost any risk that might provide tactical advantage. This desperation led to approval of experimental drugs that would have been considered too dangerous during earlier war phases. German submarine crews, facing increasingly effective Allied anti-submarine warfare, received new drug combinations designed to maintain effectiveness during extended underwater operations. These compounds, based on research conducted in concentration camps, were designed to eliminate claustrophobia and psychological stress that normally affected submarine personnel during long patrols. The new submarine drugs combined stimulants with mild hallucinogens and anxiolytics, creating artificial calm that allowed crews to function effectively even when trapped underwater for weeks. The psychological effects were dramatic. Crew members reported feeling detached from their dangerous situation, as if observing their own actions from outside their bodies. However, long-term effects were catastrophic. Crew members who survived extended patrols often suffered complete psychological breakdown when drugs wore off. The artificial calm was replaced by extreme anxiety, paranoia, and in many cases, complete mental collapse. German naval medical officers documented dozens of cases of submarine crew members requiring permanent psychiatric care after returning from drug-enhanced patrols. The Luftwaffe, facing overwhelming Allied air superiority, began experimenting with even more extreme forms of chemical enhancement. German pilots received drug combinations designed to eliminate fear and improve reaction times during combat against numerically superior enemy forces. These compounds were specifically designed to help pilots fight effectively even when they knew their missions were essentially hopeless. The new pilot drugs created mechanically enhanced awareness that allowed German aviators to continue flying combat missions despite the psychological stress of facing certain death. Pilots reported feeling disconnected from fear and able to make tactical decisions with perfect clarity, even in the most dangerous situations. The psychological cost was enormous. German aviators who survived multiple combat missions while under chemical enhancement often suffered complete personality changes. They became emotionally detached from their own experiences, unable to form normal human connections, and frequently displayed symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. German tank crews received specialized drug combinations designed to enhance performance during extended armored engagements. These compounds were designed to maintain alertness and coordination during complex tank warfare operations, while simultaneously reducing the psychological impact of witnessing their comrades' destruction. The tank crew drugs combined stimulants with mild dissociative compounds that created emotional detachment from surrounding violence. Crew members reported being able to observe the destruction of other German tanks without experiencing the normal psychological impact of witnessing their comrades' deaths. Infantry units facing the Soviet advance received what German medical officers called final mission drugs, compounds designed to maintain combat effectiveness, even when soldiers knew they were facing certain death. These drugs were specifically intended for units expected to fight to the last man, with no possibility of survival or retreat. The final mission drugs created artificial fearlessness that allowed German soldiers to continue fighting effectively, even in hopeless situations. Soldiers reported feeling mechanically brave and able to execute complex tactical maneuvers without being affected by the psychological stress of impending death. The medical consequences of these increasingly powerful combat drugs were devastating. German field hospitals reported unprecedented numbers of soldiers suffering from chemical exhaustion, a condition encompassing everything from complete psychological breakdown to organ failure caused by prolonged stimulant use. German military medical officers began documenting long-term effects of extended combat drug use. Their reports, discovered after the war, revealed the true cost of chemical enhancement. Soldiers who had been transformed into efficient killing machines were paying the price with their physical and mental health. The desperation also led to experiments with captured enemy drugs. German researchers analyzed American and Soviet stimulants, attempting to reverse engineer more effective compounds. This research revealed that other nations had developed their own approaches to chemical enhancement, each with unique advantages and disadvantages. As the war entered its final phase, German military leaders approved experimental compounds that had never been tested on human subjects. The desperation to find any possible advantage led to distribution of prototype drugs to frontline units, essentially using combat soldiers as test subjects for dangerous experimental compounds. The collapse of German chemical enhancement programs in the war's final months revealed the true extent of military drug dependence. Units that had been sustained by chemical enhancement for years found themselves unable to function when drug supplies were cut off. The Wehrmacht's addiction to combat drugs had created a fundamental weakness that contributed to Germany's final defeat. But the aftermath would prove even more devastating than the wartime consequences. Millions of veterans were about to discover that their chemical enhancement had left them with invisible wounds that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The true cost of World War II's chemical enhancement programs only became apparent after the guns fell silent. Across the globe, millions of veterans were returning home, carrying invisible wounds that military medical establishments were unprepared to treat. The men who had been transformed into chemically enhanced warriors now faced a different battle, one against their own altered brain chemistry. In Germany, the collapse of the Reich revealed the staggering scope of military drug addiction. American and Soviet forces occupying German territory discovered that entire Wehrmacht units were suffering from severe withdrawal symptoms. Soldiers who had been consuming methamphetamine for years were experiencing complete psychological breakdown when their chemical supply lines were cut off. Allied medical officers, initially puzzled by widespread nervous conditions among German prisoners, gradually realized they were witnessing the aftermath of history's first mass military drug program. The symptoms were unlike anything previously documented: extreme anxiety, violent mood swings, and complete inability to function without chemical stimulation. German military hospitals contained detailed records of medical consequences from prolonged combat drug use. These documents revealed that by 1945, the Wehrmacht had been dealing with an epidemic of drug-related medical problems that German authorities had desperately tried to conceal. The medical records documented thousands of cases of soldiers who had suffered permanent psychological damage from extended methamphetamine use. Many displayed symptoms that would later be recognized as amphetamine psychosis, paranoid delusions, hallucinations, and aggressive behavior that persisted long after drugs had left their systems. Physical complications were equally severe. German medical officers had documented widespread heart problems among soldiers who had been using stimulants for extended periods. Many veterans suffered from irregular heartbeats, high blood pressure, and other cardiovascular problems that would plague them for life. American forces in the Pacific were experiencing their own version of the chemical enhancement aftermath. Veterans returning from long bombing missions or extended submarine patrols often displayed symptoms of what military doctors called combat fatigue, but which actually represented the psychological consequences of prolonged stimulant use. The American military medical establishment had maintained detailed records of drug distribution and effects. These records revealed that while American combat drug programs had been more limited than German efforts, they had still affected hundreds of thousands of service members. American bomber crews who had flown multiple missions while under stimulant influence often returned home with severe sleep disorders. The drugs had disrupted their natural sleep patterns so thoroughly that many veterans required medical intervention to restore normal rest cycles. Some never fully recovered their ability to sleep naturally. Japanese veterans faced perhaps the most severe aftermath. The transcendence compounds that had eliminated fear and survival instincts during the war left many survivors with profound psychological damage. Veterans who had been chemically programmed to embrace death found it extremely difficult to readjust to civilian life. The Japanese military medical system, devastated by the war's end, was unable to provide adequate treatment for veterans suffering from combat drug after effects. Many former soldiers experienced severe depression, anxiety, and inability to form normal human relationships. The drugs that had made them effective warriors had left them unable to function as human beings. Soviet veterans, despite their nation's victory, faced their own chemical enhancement aftermath. The widespread use of stimulants and alcohol as combat drugs had left many Red Army veterans with severe addiction problems. The Soviet medical system was poorly equipped to deal with the psychological consequences of chemical enhancement. The scope of the veteran medical crisis was so vast that most governments initially tried to deny or minimize the problem. Military medical establishments, concerned about implications of acknowledging widespread combat drug use, often attributed veteran symptoms to other causes. This denial prevented many veterans from receiving appropriate medical care. As the 1950s progressed, the true scope of the combat drug aftermath became impossible to ignore. Veterans' hospitals across the globe began documenting unprecedented numbers of patients suffering from symptoms that could only be explained by extensive use of chemical enhancement during the war. The research into combat drug after effects revealed fundamental gaps in medical understanding of how chemical enhancement affected human physiology and psychology. The war had essentially turned millions of soldiers into unwitting test subjects for experimental drugs, and the medical establishment was now dealing with the consequences. The discovery of widespread combat drug use also raised profound ethical questions about the relationship between military necessity and medical ethics. The war had demonstrated that military leaders were willing to sacrifice soldier health for tactical advantage, but the post-war medical crisis revealed the true cost of this approach. The cover-up of these medical consequences would become one of the most systematic concealment efforts in history, as governments around the world worked to hide the true extent of what had been done to their own soldiers. The end of World War II marked the beginning of one of history's most systematic cover-ups. Governments across the globe, realizing the political and legal implications of their mass chemical enhancement programs, began a coordinated effort to bury the evidence of what had been done to their own soldiers. The true scope of combat drug use would remain hidden for decades. The United States military, despite having maintained detailed records of its stimulant programs, immediately classified all documentation related to combat drug use. The official explanation was national security, but the real reason was far more damaging. Acknowledging the scope of drug use would create massive liability for veteran medical care and potentially expose military leaders to criminal prosecution. American military medical officers received direct orders to avoid mentioning combat drugs in veteran medical records. Symptoms clearly related to stimulant use were attributed to combat fatigue or nervous exhaustion. This systematic mislabeling prevented veterans from receiving appropriate treatment and made it impossible to study long-term effects of military chemical enhancement. The cover-up extended to veteran disability claims. Veterans who applied for benefits related to symptoms caused by combat drug use were systematically denied. The Veterans Administration, operating under strict instructions from the Department of Defense, refused to acknowledge any connection between military service and drug-related medical problems. British authorities took a similar approach, classifying all records related to their mood-stabilizing drug programs and instructing medical personnel to avoid any mention of chemical enhancement in veteran treatment. The British cover-up was particularly thorough, with many documents being destroyed entirely rather than simply classified. In the Soviet Union, the cover-up took a different form. Rather than classifying documents, Soviet authorities simply denied that combat drugs had been used at all. Official Soviet military histories made no mention of chemical enhancement, and veterans who discussed their drug experiences were often accused of spreading anti-Soviet propaganda Japan's approach was complicated by the country's occupation by American forces. Japanese military records related to combat drugs were either destroyed before surrender or confiscated by American authorities. This created a situation where even Japanese researchers were unable to study the effects of their own chemical enhancement programs. The international nature of the cover-up meant that researchers in different countries were unable to share information about combat drug effects. This prevented the development of effective treatments for veteran medical problems and made it impossible to study the long-term consequences of chemical enhancement. The cover-up also extended to academic research. Universities that had been involved in developing combat drugs were instructed to classify their research and avoid publishing anything that might reveal the scope of military chemical enhancement. This prevented the scientific community from studying one of the largest human experiments in history. The pharmaceutical industry was also complicit in the cover-up. Companies that had manufactured combat drugs were instructed to destroy production records and avoid any mention of their military contracts. This prevented researchers from studying the exact composition of substances that had been used on millions of soldiers. The legal implications were enormous. By concealing the use of combat drugs, governments were avoiding potential lawsuits from veterans who had been given dangerous substances without informed consent. The cover-up essentially prevented millions of veterans from seeking legal redress for the medical damage they had suffered. The effectiveness of the cover-up was demonstrated by the fact that public awareness of combat drug use during World War II remained minimal for decades. Most people, including many veterans themselves, had no idea of the scope of chemical enhancement that had occurred during the war. The cover-up began to unravel in the 1970s, when changing attitudes toward government secrecy and veteran rights made it more difficult to maintain official denials. Freedom of information requests and congressional investigations began to reveal the true scope of combat drug use during World War II. The revelations had profound implications for how society viewed the relationship between military service and government responsibility. The discovery that millions of soldiers had been given dangerous drugs without their knowledge or consent fundamentally changed public understanding of military medical ethics. The legacy of World War II's chemical enhancement programs extends far beyond the individuals who were directly affected. The normalization of chemical enhancement in military contexts, the development of sophisticated cover-up techniques, and the establishment of permanent relationships between military organizations and pharmaceutical companies all had lasting implications. The lessons learned about manipulating human performance through drugs would influence everything from Cold War espionage programs to modern military operations. The techniques developed for creating chemically enhanced soldiers became the foundation for decades of classified research into human enhancement and mind control. The ethical questions raised by these programs remain unresolved today. The fundamental tension between military necessity and individual welfare that drove the development of combat drugs during World War II continues to influence modern debates about human enhancement, military medicine, and the limits of government authority. The story of drugs in World War II serves as both a historical record and a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing military objectives over human welfare. The chemical enhancement programs demonstrated that even well-intentioned efforts to improve soldier performance could have devastating consequences for the individuals involved and for society as a whole. The hidden history of drugs during World War II reveals a conflict that was fundamentally different from the one described in traditional military histories. While conventional accounts focus on strategy, tactics, and technology, the chemical enhancement programs of the 1940s show us a war fought not just between nations, but between competing visions of human enhancement and the acceptable limits of military medicine. The transformation of millions of soldiers into chemically enhanced warriors represented one of the largest human experiments in history. The scale and scope of these programs dwarfed anything that had come before, creating a generation of veterans who carried the invisible wounds of chemical warfare within their own bodies. The legacy of World War II's combat drug programs extends far beyond the individuals who were directly affected. The normalization of chemical enhancement in military contexts, the development of sophisticated cover-up techniques, and the establishment of permanent relationships between military organizations and pharmaceutical companies all had lasting implications for how societies approach the enhancement of of human capabilities. The ethical questions raised by these programs remain unresolved today. The fundamental tension between military necessity and individual welfare that drove the development of combat drugs during World War II continues to influence modern debates about human enhancement, military medicine, and the limits of government authority over individual bodies. The story of drugs in World War II also serves as a reminder of the importance of transparency and accountability in military medical research. The successful concealment of massive chemical enhancement programs for decades demonstrates the need for robust oversight systems and the dangers of allowing military organizations to conduct medical experiments without public knowledge or consent. As we face an uncertain future filled with new technologies for enhancing human performance, the lessons of World War II's chemical enhancement programs provide valuable insights into both the potential and the dangers of these approaches. The history of combat drugs during the 1940s shows us that the pursuit of military advantage through chemical enhancement can exact a terrible price on the individuals involved and on society as a whole. The millions of soldiers who were chemically enhanced during World War II paid that price with their health, their humanity, and in many cases, their lives. Their sacrifice was not made on the battlefield against enemy forces, but in the hidden laboratories and classified programs that transformed them into something other than human beings. The true cost of World War II's chemical enhancement programs may never be fully known. The systematic cover-up of these programs, the destruction of medical records, and the deliberate concealment of veteran medical problems have made it impossible to calculate the complete human toll of military chemical enhancement. What we do know is that the chemical enhancement programs of World War II fundamentally changed the nature of warfare and the relationship between military organizations and the individuals who serve in them. The precedents established during the 1940s continue to influence military medical research and human enhancement programs today. The story of drugs in World War II is ultimately a story about the limits of human endurance and the lengths to which societies will go to overcome those limitations. It is a story about the price of military effectiveness and the cost of chemical enhancement. Most importantly, it is a story about the millions of individuals who were transformed by these programs and the lasting impact of their experiences on the world we live in today. The hidden history of chemical enhancement during World War II reminds us that the greatest conflicts in human history often involve not just battles between armies, but struggles over the very nature of human existence. The chemical enhancement programs of the 1940s represented an attempt to transcend natural human limitations through pharmaceutical intervention, but they ultimately revealed the dangers of treating human beings as mere machines to be optimized for military purposes. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.